There is a silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but a dense, almost palpable presence that envelops everything and compels those who feel it to look inward. Carl Jung understood that this silence was not empty, but rather a fertile space where the most important battles of the soul take place. Because solitude is not limited to physical separation from people. It is a profound psychological state where every social mask falls away, revealing a face often unknown, even to the one who carries it. It is in this territory that the rawest truth about who we are manifests far from the voices constantly telling us what we should be. For Jung, solitude was an inevitable necessity for anyone wishing to find the self, that living, creative, and untamed essence dwelling in the depths of every human being. Society trains us from earliest childhood to avoid this experience. We are taught to occupy every second, to fill every void with noise, distraction, constant companionship. The fear of solitude becomes intertwined with the fear of nothingness, of facing what we truly are. Because when the external world falls silent, what remains is us, stripped of all the stories we tell others and ourselves. Jung described this as the moment when the persona, that carefully shaped mask we wear to survive in the collective, begins to fragment. And it is in this shattering that many panic, because they suddenly realize they may have never truly known themselves. What seemed to be a solid identity begins to reveal itself as mere performance, as theater. However, there is something sacred in this process, because it is in this seemingly hostile space that the psyche creates the images, symbols, and answers that cannot emerge under the spotlight of everyday life. It is there, in the intimate depths, that the forces capable of reconstructing us are found. Jung called this the creative void, a state suspended between destruction and possibility, where everything hangs in balance. Those who have the courage to remain there without fleeing, without numbing themselves with distractions, discover that from apparent nothingness arise paths that could never have been seen before. But this courage is not simple. It requires bearing the weight of profound questions without immediate answers. It requires standing before oneself as before an abyss, looking directly into the darkness. Even so, paradoxically, it is in solitude that we often find the deepest connection with all that is human. When we disconnect from external noise, we begin to realize that we are not isolated individuals, but immersed in something that transcends us, the collective unconscious. As Jung said, it is in this immersion that we can feel that the pain we carry is not just ours, but also the pain of all humanity. That our searches echo universal quests that have existed for millennia. Solitude, therefore, does not distance us from humanity. On the contrary, it returns us to it through a much truer path. It lifts the veil that makes us believe we are alone in our suffering and in our dreams. If you are watching this video, perhaps there is within you a restlessness that makes you look at silence, not only with fear, but also with curiosity. Perhaps you have already felt that discomfort that arises when everything that seems certain begins to lose meaning. When you realize that there is something in you that longs for space, for truth, for freedom. Carl Jung believed that ignoring this voice is to condemn oneself to live an incomplete life, a life of performance rather than authenticity. Today I want you to know that despite all the fear and pain, there is a profound promise contained in this void. The promise of reconnecting with yourself, not as someone returning to the same familiar place, but as someone discovering themselves authentically for the first time. And it is this journey that I invite you to begin here with me, because there is no greater solitude than living disconnected from oneself, and there is no greater freedom than finally finding who you truly are. There comes a moment in life when silence becomes so profound that it seems to tear the surface of reality, exposing something that was once carefully hidden beneath layers of performance. Carl Jung was one of the few thinkers to accurately describe what happens when we find ourselves deprived of the social mirror that sustains our everyday identity. He taught that we all wear a persona, a social mask, that we learn to construct in order to survive and relate to the world. This mask is not just a superficial disguise. It is an intricate psychological structure composed of gestures, opinions, beliefs, ways of speaking, preferences, and even dreams that often did not originate from within us, but were absorbed from others' expectations. We live for years, sometimes entire decades, believing that this persona is who we truly are. We believe in it so completely that we shape our entire destiny according to its demands. We make career choices based on it. We enter relationships to maintain it. We suppress aspects of ourselves that don't fit the image. But solitude, relentless and brutally honest, arrives as a force capable of imploding this structure. When the external world falls silent, when there is no audience to perform for, we realize with shocking clarity that many of the roles we play do not actually belong to us. The praise we desperately seek, the approval we constantly need, the image we work so hard to project, all of this reveals itself as the mortar holding up a facade. In the absence of the other's validating gaze, we see how much of what we call self is in fact contaminated by the need for acceptance. And that is where the symbolic death of the persona begins. It is not a quick or painless process. It is like shedding layers of skin, feeling the raw flesh exposed to the cold air. It is terrifying to realize that many of our strongest convictions, things we defend with such fervor, may have been merely adaptations to our environment rather than genuine expressions of our soul. Jung described this process as a kind of necessary inner death, a death that must occur for something new and authentic to be born. Because as long as we remain trapped in the persona, imprisoned by the need to maintain the mask, there is no space for the self, the most authentic and creative core of our being, to fully manifest. The persona may protect us from social rejection, but it also imprisons us, keeping us within narrow limits, where nothing truly alive can grow or flourish. Solitude forces us to confront the contradictions we hide, the desires we silence, the fears we pretend not to feel. And when there is no one left to witness our performance, the possibility arises to look at all of this without masks, without justifications, without the exhausting need to appear strong or coherent. It is a brutal confrontation with reality. But it is also the beginning of a freedom that would have been unthinkable while wearing the mask. However, between the fall of the persona and the emergence of a new authentic self, a strange and deeply disconcerting space opens up, a space that Jung called the creative void. If this content is making sense to you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue this work. Between the death of the persona and the emergence of a new self, a space opens up that is not just silence, but a vast, almost uninhabitable psychological territory, where everything seems to have lost meaning. Carl Jung named this territory the creative void, a psychic place where the old forms of identity have been destroyed, but the new ones have not yet taken shape. It is like floating in a sea without any horizon visible, with no land in sight, no compass pointing in any direction. This void, despite its name, is not completely devoid of content. It is pregnant with possibilities, full of yet to be revealed potentials. But these potentials present themselves in such an amorphous, undefined way that we can initially only perceive the threat, not the promise. And it is precisely this absence of clear contours, this feeling of not knowing who one is or where one is going, that makes this space so terrifying for most people. Jung deeply experienced this transition zone during his own periods of isolation, when he retreated to Bollingen and immersed himself intensely in his inner visions, meticulously recorded in the Red Book. He knew from direct experience that this void was not just gratuitous suffering, but an essential stage of the individuation process. Because everything that has been deconstructed, the certainties, the roles, the inherited beliefs, needs to make way for something new and authentic. But before the new can emerge, we are forced to confront apparent nothingness. And nothingness has a destructive power because it puts into question even the fundamental will to continue existing. It is not uncommon for a person entering this void to feel on the brink of madness. It is a territory where ordinary language fails, where internal images become more vivid than the external world, where disconnected thoughts seem to overshadow objective reality. And yet, it is precisely there that the creative power Jung valued so highly resides. In the creative void, all old answers lose their validity. The old narratives we told about our lives no longer serve to give meaning to existence. It is at this moment that the great existential questions arise, those that have no immediate or comfortable answer. Who am I without everything that previously defined me? What lies beyond the roles I have played? What does it mean to truly live if it is not just to fulfill expectations? Jung did not offer easy answers to these questions. On the contrary, he insisted on the critical importance of remaining in this state of uncertainty, of enduring the profound discomfort of not knowing, because fleeing from the void prematurely is to kill the seeds of creation before they can germinate. It is in this seemingly barren ground that the self begins to organize new forms, new images, new paths forward. But this only happens if we have the courage to inhabit the void without trying to hastily fill it with distractions, superficial explanations, or emotional anesthetics. And although it seems cruel, this void is also extraordinarily fertile, because everything that has not yet existed in us finds space to emerge. Jung saw there an almost magical energy, a force that can both destroy us and transform us completely. It is at this point that techniques such as active imagination, deliberate silence, and even the formulation of questions without demanding immediate answers become precious tools. Not to flee from the void, but to endure it consciously. To allow something genuinely new to come to the surface, something genuinely ours, not imposed from outside. Because it is only there, in the darkness of this not knowing, that we begin to intuit the existence of a deeper self, a self that is not dictated by circumstances or the gaze of others, but emerges from our own depths. If there is something that solitude offers us, it is the brutal and simultaneously sacred opportunity to become strangers to ourselves, to meet ourselves as if for the first time. For Carl Jung, being alone was not just a pause in social interaction, but a psychic laboratory where experiences that could never emerge under the light of the collective gaze finally found space to flourish. It is in this state that one of the most disconcerting phases of the individuation process begins, the encounter with internal contents that until then were hidden beneath the thick layer of the persona. There, in solitude, without the need to play expected roles, previously censored thoughts begin to sprout, bringing to the surface desires, fears, fantasies, and impulses that seemed completely incompatible with the carefully constructed image we maintain before the world. Jung knew that the human mind is a stage where dramas as deep as they are contradictory are constantly enacted. When we isolate ourselves voluntarily, we give permission for these inner plays to present themselves uncut, uncensored, without the immediate intervention of the vigilant superego that judges and labels everything as right or wrong. And this can be genuinely terrifying, because we discover that within us reside characters we never imagined we carried. A woman recognized for her gentleness may find herself overtaken by overwhelming rage. A man proud of his rationality may find himself grappling with almost mystical intuitions that challenge all his logic. A person who considers themselves moral may discover shadowy desires they never acknowledged. These contents are not just insignificant psychic residues to be dismissed. They are rich, raw material for the construction of a more whole and true personality. It is in solitude that we are called to witness these emerging fragments, not as good or bad, not as acceptable or shameful, but as legitimate parts of our being that deserve recognition. Jung warned that if we do not consciously recognize these facets, they do not simply disappear. They merely hide in the unconscious, where they begin to influence our choices and behaviors, indirectly, often destructively. Therefore, voluntary isolation, far from being an escape from reality, can be a profound practice of courage, because it implies accepting that we are not linear, simple, or solely coherent beings. It involves looking into our own abysses and enduring the discomfort of seeing in ourselves impulses that we would never dare to admit in public. This authenticity does not emerge as something pure or beautiful in the conventional sense. It emerges as something alive, pulsating, imperfect, profoundly and messily human. But there is also an extraordinary gift in this process, because by recognizing these internal forces, we discover new possibilities of being that were previously foreclosed. The artist who deemed himself uninspired discovers in isolation the deep source of his creativity. The individual who believed himself fundamentally weak finds in contact with his shadows an unexpected strength. It is as if in solitude we could experimentally wear versions of ourselves that in society would be immediately condemned to exile. There, no one observes us, no one judges us, and we can be ugly, contradictory, poetic, grandiose, or miserable and above all true. This internal laboratory is the space where authenticity is forged not as a perfect ideal to achieve, but as the radical acceptance of who we are, with all our lights and shadows integrated. In solitude, something happens to time that defies any rational explanation. For Carl Jung, the experience of deep isolation not only reveals ourselves to us, but also tears apart the chronological fabric of reality, blending past, present, and future into a living tapestry where everything coexists. It is as if the clock that marks the hours loses all relevance and is replaced by psychological time, an internal rhythm where the oldest memories can appear with the same clarity and immediacy as recent events. And glimpses of what has yet to happen emerge as realities as tangible as any memory. This experience is not mere nostalgia or idle daydreaming. It is an immersion in a field of psychic forces where our personal biography connects with something infinitely greater. The history of humanity, archetypal images, the pains and hopes of all those who came before us. Jung lived this intensely, especially during the years he dedicated to his inner journey, meticulously recorded in the Red Book. In his writings, he recounts how in states of deep solitude, images and characters from centuries past would appear in his mind with impressive clarity, as if they were alive and present beside him. He perceived these visions not as hallucinations or mental illness, but as legitimate manifestations of the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche that transcends the individual and belongs to all humanity. In those hours of deep solitude, isolation ceases to be merely a private space and becomes a bridge to much broader realities, where we are simultaneously witnesses and protagonists of dramas that seem to echo through generations. It is in this expanded time that we can understand that our personal pains and fears are not just ours, but part of something much greater that has been unfolding for millennia. This altered temporal dimension opens extraordinary possibilities for self-knowledge. When we are deeply alone, we can revisit episodes from childhood, not just as distant memories, but almost as present experiences, feeling again with full intensity the emotions, the smells, the atmosphere of those moments. And likewise, we can project our consciousness forward, intuiting possible paths, lives we could still live, choices we can yet make. Jung called this ability personal archaeology, digging through the layers of memory to discover patterns that repeat, unresolved stories that continue to influence the present in invisible ways. It is not uncommon for deep perceptions about issues we thought we had completely overcome to arise in this process, revealing that they still exert a secret power over our daily decisions. Furthermore, in solitude, there is the experience of circular time, a sense that certain themes, fears, or questions return to our lives at different phases, as if they spiral ever closer to some essential center. Jung saw this as an essential movement for individuation, because revisiting the same subjects from new perspectives is what allows for progressively deeper understanding of who we are. It is also in solitude that it becomes possible to establish internal dialogues with past or future versions of ourselves, creating what Jung called temporal conversation. We can speak to the teenager we once were, listen to their hurts or interrupted dreams with compassion. And we can also converse with the elder we will become, seeking advice, wisdom, or courage from that future self. These experiences are not merely exercises of imagination to pass time. They are powerful ways to integrate dispersed parts of the psyche, building a more solid and coherent self across time. It is a fascinating mystery that precisely when we distance ourselves from the world, we can feel almost painfully how much we belong to it. For Carl Jung, this is one of the greatest paradoxes of human experience. It is in deep isolation, when we cut off external voices and dive into our own abysses, that we become capable of perceiving the invisible strings that connect us to everything and everyone. It is in solitude that universal truths emerge, those that do not belong solely to our personal history, but that resonate with the frequency of the collective unconscious, that immense reservoir of images, symbols, and experiences that Jung identified as the common psychic heritage of all humanity. Even when alone, we discover that our anguish echoes the anguish of millions of human beings throughout the centuries, that our yearnings, our pains, our doubts are individual variations of ancient melodies that all of humanity has sung. During his retreats in Bollingen, Jung experienced this connection in an almost mystical way. The absolute silence, the long hours of contemplation by the lake, the complete withdrawal from society, all of this transported him to a dimension where he could feel in a concrete, visceral way that his individuality was immersed in an infinite sea of shared human experiences. He understood that there are thoughts that are not just ours, but that flow through us like underground currents, coming from remote eras, from ancestors we never knew, but whose psychic patterns we carry. This is why, in the most intense solitude, we can be struck by images or emotions that seem to have no direct relation to our daily lives. Archetypal images that emerge from the depths of the psyche, bringing messages that speak as much of us as individuals and of humanity as a whole. Jung wrote that often solitude reveals itself as a space where we unknowingly converse with universal figures. The wise one, the hero, the old king, the great mother, the trickster. These are primordial symbols that connect us to the rest of humanity, and that simultaneously help us to better understand who we are in our uniqueness. However, this perception of unity with all humanity does not impose itself gently. On the contrary, it often arrives as a devastating realization that can temporarily shatter our sense of individual specialness. Because recognizing that our deepest pain is also everyone's pain can initially feel like a loss of identity. But ultimately, it is profoundly liberating. When we understand that we are not alone in our suffering, that every human being throughout history has faced similar demons, the weight becomes somehow more bearable. We are no longer isolated in our struggle, but part of an ancient human journey toward consciousness. And paradoxically, it is through recognizing this shared humanity that we finally discover what makes us truly unique, not our suffering, which is universal, but how we choose to respond to it, how we transform it, how we create meaning from it. This is Jung's profound gift to us, the understanding that solitude is not the opposite of connection, but its deepest form. That by withdrawing from the superficial noise of society, we can finally hear the ancient voice of humanity speaking through us. And in that voice, we discover both who we have always been and who we might yet become. The journey into solitude is not an escape from life. It is a return to its source. It is not a rejection of humanity, but a way of honoring it by first honoring the truth of our own being. If you have felt the call to this journey, know that you are not walking a path of weakness or avoidance. You are walking the path of the courageous, those who dare to meet themselves in the darkness, trusting that what they find there will ultimately connect them more deeply to all that is. This is the sacred solitude Jung spoke of, and it awaits you whenever you are ready to enter.